Don't want that.
Not in this setting, but another setting.
So we are live officially 2 minutes before the top of the hour. So we're going to give our participants a little bit extra time to join in. And I would love everyone, when you enter, just write where you are dialing in from. It's been wonderful to see over the past 5 weeks throughout all of our Office Shock LinkedIn Live talks that we've been able to touch really across the globe practitioners who are interested in having a conversation about how Office Shock might turn this challenging times into a great opportunity for creating better futures for working and living. So do please in the chat write in where you're located. Be also wonderful, just to give a quick note, what your thoughts are on the spectrum of outcomes. If you've had the chance to read the chapter, let us know what you see as being those key choices of equitable enterprises across that spectrum of outcomes. And according to my Swiss rail clock that you see in the back, we are officially at the top of the hour. So welcome, everyone. My name is Joseph Press, co-author of Office Shock, Creating Better Futures for Working and Living. And I'm really excited and honored to have the Institute for the Future's Executive Director, Marina Gorbis, with us today. This is a continuation of the Office Shock LinkedIn Live talks that we've been having since the book was launched just 5 weeks ago on the 17th of January. We've been getting wonderful feedback about these talks, primarily because we've been able to put into practice the objective of the book, stimulating conversations about these spectrums of choice that in the book, myself, Bob Johansen, and Chris Bolin identified as being essential for us to begin thinking differently about the workplace, office, officing, how do we work, in order for us to turn this opportunity into a chance to create better futures for working and living. Today's conversation is all about the spectrum of outcomes. That's chapter 6 in the book. And in many ways, this chapter about the spectrum of outcomes is one of the toughest ones. It was certainly one of the toughest ones for us to write because there are a number of complex economic topics, but there's also some very simple categories describing the economic models, which are really creating a lot of noise. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today with Marina to help us try to cut through the noise and really learn from the latest research that Marina and the team have been working on in relation to equitable enterprises. Now, the spectrum of outcomes in Office Shock ranges from profit to prosperity, from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And Marina, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thinking and where the Equitable Enterprises Initiative is on that span of outcomes.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and good morning or good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Yes, we started the Equitable Enterprise Initiative about 2 years ago. It's funded by 5 foundations and brought a group of advisors who are academics, some of them people who are running, they're practical visionaries, what we call, they're running such enterprises, trying to create them. Some of them are kind of in social movements, and other people, some of them technology experts. But really, it was kind of an outgrowth of many years of looking at what's happening with work, kind of the evolution of gig work and new patterns of work. And what we were hearing is that a lot of emphasis was placed on technologies. Everything will be automated, will be automated out. Everybody has to be upskilled. Basically, everybody needs to be a programmer. Not in those words, I'm exaggerating, but it's all like the burden was on the worker. We all have to do something. And we felt like it's great to get training. It's great to get education. I'm a big believer in education in general. But it was kind of misplaced because there was a gap, there was a vacuum. People were not looking at the structure of the enterprise itself. And we felt like the root cause, or one of the really root causes of such inequalities, is the nature of the enterprise, and also the nature of the environment, the larger social environment in which enterprises sit. And when we were looking specifically at what's called gig work or independent work, or if you work as an influencer, there are all kinds of possibilities now with technologies. It does have great possibilities for it giving people flexibility, but unfortunately, it's what we call asset-free work. Meaning, if you think about assets are key resources that allows you to have economic security and economic mobility, so things like retirement savings, healthcare access, holidays, all kinds of other things. This work basically was really asset poor. And given particularly in the US, the environment, the lack of the very solid social safety net, of course, it looks very different in Europe. It's much easier to be a gig. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's much different to be a gig worker in Germany or Switzerland or in England, where you have a social safety net that's independent of your employment. And it looks very different in the US. So we really wanted to focus on what is the form of the enterprise itself and how it influences the outcomes for people, working people and others. And what are the forms of equitable enterprise that are possible given the transformations of technology, given some of the demographic changes and everything else. So we've been focusing on and talking to people. These forms of enterprise exist, and our definition, you can put different definitions of equitable, and we can talk about that. That's one of the issues, is there's a whole variety of equitable enterprises and how people think about them. But to us, it was, the definition was an equitable enterprise. It's the one that basically distributes assets more equitably among people who are contributed to the value of the enterprise. And so that can take multiple forms. Cooperatives is one of the probably most prominent forms of more equitable enterprises, where workers actually own shares and sometimes participate in governance and other things. There's community trusts, where people are members of the trust itself, and it's kind of more of a public resource or community resource. There are things of limited profit companies. There's, of course, nonprofits, which is, I would think, is an equitable form of enterprise. There are utilities that are regulated utilities, where it's, again, available. It basically provides an asset for everybody. To think about these kinds of public resources, that they're available to everybody. And so it's another form of kind of giving people access to these assets without ownership. So that's what we've been focusing on.
And if I understand correctly, Marina, the signals of change that you just identified, the cooperatives that you've mentioned, platform cooperatives, for example, the shared assets to make it from asset poor to asset rich, that there is more employee ownership. Is it fair to say that those signals are giving you indications that the needle is moving in the direction of more shared prosperity? If we go back to our spectrum of outcomes, is that fair to say that you're seeing that movement?
I definitely, even in the last couple of years, I just see a lot more conversations moving in that direction. People talking about moral economy. People are talking, stakeholder economy was something people were talking about for several years now. I see it at events. I see it in various kinds of publications, that there's more conversations that are happening in that direction. And there's clearly more interest and sort of uplifting of these kinds of forms. So yeah, I do see that. That there's like increased interest in that. It doesn't mean that we still have policies or regulatory mechanisms in place yet, but the conversations are definitely happening. I like none other than Milton Friedman had this phrase that we have to have a lot of ideas sitting around waiting for the right moment to actually move into the mainstream. And at that point, something that seems, I forget the exact phrase, but something seems like impossible becomes inevitable. And so we're at that point where, and I think that our goal is to be that place for deliberation. I don't think there are any sort of easy solutions to this, but a place for deliberation and looking at alternatives so that, when waiting for the right moment for the impossible become inevitable.
Very interesting that Milton Friedman said that, because you
Yes.
quote quite often, and we actually have in the book Friedman's other quote, which is oft-quoted, that the primary function of an enterprise is to fulfill shareholder value.
Yeah.
I'm curious to get your sense of what's causing that change. What's causing the needle to move in that direction towards more shared prosperity?
Yeah. I think it's basically the reality of extreme wealth and income inequality. If you look at particularly in the US, but also growing in other places in Europe and other places. So there's a point at which society just doesn't function well when you have these extreme inequalities. Like the kind of polarization we're seeing, political polarization, is connected to the sense of distrust. We're not living in the same worlds anymore. When you have these extreme sort of wealth inequalities, you literally don't intersect with people who live on the other end. So we're losing this sense of empathy, and it's contributing to this kind of polarization. I also think that after years of decline of the labor movement, we're seeing kind of a change in that, where it's not that membership in unions is increasing that much, but there is increasing sort of emphasis and interest in empowering workers. I think the other thing is actually the pandemic. The pandemic changed our views on many, many different things. And one of them is that the whole notion of essential work. Like if you think about what do we think who do we put into that category, the essential workers? It's nurses, it's doctors, it's caretakers, all teachers and others, and maybe with the exception of doctors, but even doctors, these are low paid, low wage, very insecure professions. And so how is it that our essential workers are really not getting paid much?
And that actually is very complementary to the spectrum right before the spectrum of outcomes, the spectrum of purpose. So clearly in that example of healthcare, a collective or shared purpose of being able to provide as much healthcare, certainly during the pandemic, it was very acute, but there's certainly more and more awareness of the importance of having a shared purpose of providing more people healthcare. And it would seem like that, as you have said, would also contribute to more of an appreciation for those frontline workers that are making the biggest impact. How do you see, you mentioned technology earlier, and particularly I know that you've written about the technologies of gig platforms when they came onto the scene 10, 12 years ago as that business model ramped up. Do you see a risk of the technology actually exacerbating the current inequalities, or is there potential to actually reconcile and rebalance some of those inequalities?
Yeah. It's interesting in terms of technology, and particularly here in Silicon Valley, I think we tend to overestimate the impact of technology because everything is focused on technology development. I do have to say, and I've been reflecting a lot on that, in 2013, I wrote a book called Social Structing. And like many people, I was really excited about the possibilities of these technologies like basically connective technologies and technologies that allow us to do gig work, and powering these platforms and everything else to, create commons ventures, make a lot more things public, give access to more people. And we were seeing signals of a lot of that happening. But I think what I underestimated, and I did like 3 scenarios of where this can go. One is, more commons-based, more open, more community-based, and giving more people access. That was really the scenario I emphasized, the possibilities and imagining. But the other side, the dark scenario, was what we call digital feudalism, where it's more and more, if you think about platforms like Facebook or Twitter or anybody, we're all working for them, right? Because they're based on, we're doing free labor. We're not only entering content, which is time, right, that we don't get paid for, that's financialized, but they're getting our data, our behavioral data, all kinds of data for free. We don't get paid for that. So that to me is reminded of feudalism, where there were, on feudal estates, there were commons resources where the peasants could use for pasture and growing things and all of that, but they were taxed on that, and most of that belonged to the lord of the manor. So you were given a free resource, but you were also exploited in the process. So, and unfortunately, what happened is that we moved in that direction. And to me, it just indicates that technology, yes, they come with capabilities, right? They have certain elements that are intrinsic to them. Like, we couldn't do that, what we're doing now, doing a remote conversation, if we didn't have the internet, if we didn't have the basic communications technology, we wouldn't be doing remote work. So it does come in with certain capabilities, but it's shaped, and how it ultimately shapes our work and our behaviors is a product of other things, of regulatory, of cultural norms, of all kinds of things. So if you look at the same platform like Uber, it works very differently in Germany than it does in the US. In Germany, they have to work with licensed operators, private companies. The workers have to be licensed and certified. There's very different social safety net. As I said, it's easier to be a gig worker in Europe than it is in the US. So ultimately, we shape these, the famous, I think it's Marshall McLuhan, he said, we invent our technologies, and thereafter our technologies reinvent us. And so technologies do, as I said, they shape a lot of things, and they come with capabilities, and they shape things in multiple ways, like how we access work. Now it's common for us to go to LinkedIn and search for work, or Monster, online, all kinds of things, how people get paid, how their work is counted. We have technologies that really calculate how many minutes you spent on the task. So technology can shape and influence work in many, many ways, but it's also really sits in the larger social, economic, tax, regulatory context that shapes it.
And you mentioned the cultural aspects as well. One example that comes to mind is the co-op of taxi drivers in New York City, and the rise of cooperative platforms. Some of the research that you've done in Equitable Enterprises, and we've also included in the chapter, draws on the work from Trevor Schultz and Nate Schneider. Do you see cooperative platforms as that intersection between technology shaping us, but also people coming together, looking for that sense of belonging and driving for more prosperity, shared economic interest, not just selfish? Is that in a
absolutely. I do think that, and I've been involved with platform cooperativism and Traber's work for a long time, and I do see it as one approach to it. The problem with well, at least as I said, in the US. And because these political social contexts are very different in different countries, you have to look at it very differently. But one of the issues with what we consider to be equitable enterprises is that we don't have a level playing field for them. So if you think about platform co-ops, it's very hard to get funding, to get capital to invest in these platforms, because ultimately the way you make your investments worthwhile, and it's IPO, it's exit, right? You either sell, so investors have to get funding and get returns, back to Milton Friedman.
Right.
And so with platform co-ops, it's much harder to get funding, right? So it's, if you compare the kind of investment that Uber got from VCs and the kind of investment that either Drivers Co-op or any other platform co-op, it's very, very, it's not comparable.
Well, you've mentioned the social conditions, you've mentioned the cultural technicians, and what you're describing now is really putting into context the economic conditions. And love to hear your latest thoughts on kind of the elephant in the room when we look at the spectrum of outcomes. Is the emphasis on shareholder capitalism?
Yeah, there have been so many words that people have used to describe shareholder capitalism, post-neoliberalism, post-capitalism, you name it. Our 10-year forecast event is actually called, the whole series is called Changing the Register, which is really thinking about the register. We got it from linguistic anthropologists who kind of define the register as a vocabulary, the words we use and frameworks that describe how we see reality. So even the shareholder capitalism, to me, describes a certain kind of reality, right? And so I think our goal is that we can move to a different space and develop different kinds of words. I do think that the goals of probably shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism are, they're good, but the reality of it is we haven't done much in that direction.
Right. And it's wonderful I'm looking forward to learning tomorrow. TOIF, just a quick plug, is going to be taking place tomorrow. And Marina and the rest of the IFTF team is going to be sharing the 10-year forecast, focusing on, as you mentioned, changing the register. When we were writing Office Shock about this time last year and kind of drawing on some of the initial findings from Equitable Enterprises, one of the insights that we found to be very important to kind of cut through what Bob Johansen, my co-author and longtime leader of the Institute of the Future, talks about those categories and those boxes of categories. Taking them apart, we ended up landing on two very important topics related to the spectrum of outcomes: membership, so how do people engage with enterprises, and ownership. And I'm curious to get your insights, if there's anything you can share about the latest research that will be made public tomorrow on those two topics.
Yeah, our latest report, we actually did a series of interviews, qualitative interviews with people who are running what we consider to be different kinds of equitable enterprises. So as I said, co-ops, community trusts, public banks, and others. And the main conclusion of the report, not surprisingly, is that there's a whole variety of definitions of how people think what is equitable. And everybody is kind of navigating some of these dilemmas about there is no such thing as a pure equitable enterprise. That would probably mean that everybody gets paid the same. I mean, I don't know, depending on your definition.
I can give you an example, Marina.
Sorry?
I can give you an example. That's what is called a kibbutz in Israel. I spent some time there. And 100 years ago, there were about 95 of these kibbutzim. Today, there are about 3.
Right.
So I think this idea that you're articulating, a dream of a truly equitable enterprise, is certainly probably not in existence, and much more of an illusion in people's minds than in reality.
Yeah, and it's, as you know, I spent my early life in what was then the Soviet Union, which supposedly was a very equitable, and it's true, people were paid the same, but would you define that as equitable if somebody works a lot more? So it's one of those, Bob likes to talk about navigating dilemmas. It's one of these dilemmas, and everybody we interviewed is sort of navigating this themselves, this specter of choices and these kinds of dilemmas. So, for example, if you think about ownership and like the governance systems, people are constantly trying to balance, well, more hierarchical leadership is more efficient. It's easier to make decisions. We all know that, at least in the short term. So do you go that way, particularly if you're competing with enterprises that are less equitable but more hierarchical? Or is the whole point to distribute governance and make it more into a membership where everybody has a voice? So that's one kind of spectrum of choice that people are making. The other kind of spectrum is around even things like, what do you maximize for? Do you maximize your enterprise so you're, like, let's say a co-op, so that people who are members are paid more, so you maximize to get the maximum returns, right? But it may have deleterious effects on your people, your suppliers, or on your community. So who do you include in that membership? Who is a member? How widely do you define? And that's inevitable. Even Mondragon, which is the largest co-op in Spain, in the Basque country, 20% of the Basque economy, there is some criticism because, I mean, it's a wonderful co-op and a great example of what's possible, but they're also using suppliers who may not be as equitable as they are, but they have to compete. So everybody, I don't think that the equitable enterprise is something where there's one model. I think there are different sort of definitions and different approaches of how people think about equity. James' book, The Variety of Religious Experience, we talk about the variety of the equitable enterprise experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, you mentioned the different definitions of equity. One of the very important topics that we raised in our chapter was the definitions of value. What have you seen in the latest research and some of those conversations that you've had? How are people defining value, and how is that informing some of the choices that they are making to try to create a more equitable enterprise?
I think that's very much part of that sort of navigation of what is the purpose of this? What are you trying to accomplish? On that, there is a kind of a spectrum also of ways of approaching it, where some people are trying to basically use the existing system, right, and do well within the system. So you find different hacks, different ways, different avenues, like you're looking for those space, because it's not easy to start and to manage and to be successful in an equitable enterprise in a highly inequitable economy and a highly inequitable system, right? So people are trying to kind of hack the system and find ways to build something that's better, right? On the other side, there are people who see their enterprise itself as a kind of a political statement, where we want to do it because by our existence, and if we succeed, it shows an alternative, right? So all the enterprises have to be profitable. They have, or at least be able to survive, right? So that's a given, which is not the case for a lot of venture-based businesses, right? Like Uber can lose money for 10 years and be just fine.
Right.
They can't afford to do that. So all these enterprises have to be profitable. And there's kind of a, I think, misconception that if you're in a co-op or if you're in one of these enterprises that you actually don't make money. You do. Otherwise, you just wouldn't survive. Same is a nonprofit. You wouldn't survive if you don't get funding. We don't have the luxury, which is kind of interesting because I always think about who's a nonprofit as who is a for-profit. But so there's that. But on the other side, there are people who want to, and sometimes it comes at the expense of having returns, and sometimes it comes at the expense of workers' wages in some way. But people are committed to something as a more than economic and political statement.
The commitment that you just raised is very interesting, and it reminds me a bit of the conversation that we had last week with Ibrahim Jackson about the spectrum of belonging. In those conversations that you've been having, that you'll be sharing tomorrow at TYF, have you been hearing more emphasis on that sense of belonging? You had also mentioned some equitable enterprises that are in existence because they are making a statement that they are in existence. How is belonging playing into the glue to be able to bring people together to overcome those challenges? And I'm a co-founder of a cooperative, a platform cooperative, and facing those challenges for the last 2.5 years of our existence, everything that you've mentioned. So I'm curious, what has been the role of belonging, bringing people together with a common purpose to help overcome those challenges to truly create or co-create an equitable enterprise?
Yeah, and again, it varies for different kinds of enterprises. Some of them are very explicit about it. You know, people talk about solidarity economy and creating alternatives. So it is about belonging. And one of the people we're going to bring in tomorrow, Jessica Gordon Nembhard, who is a professor at John Jay School, wrote this book called Collective Courage. I hate to be revealing what we'll be doing tomorrow, but she wrote about the history of African-American co-ops and how it was, nobody has written about it for a long time, but they were very much in existence and were very popular in African-American communities. And usually people who have not been able to participate in the mainstream economies, they're the ones who are creating and trying to create by necessity these kinds of alternative enterprises, the ways of pulling resources. If you think about mutual benefit societies in the US, they were mostly created by immigrants who pulled resources. They were excluded from the mainstream. You know, in Silicon Valley, there was a great group called TIE, the Indus Entrepreneurs, and they were all people, Indians who came to the US as immigrants. And the lore was that, oh, you're good as an engineer, but you can't manage companies. So they created their own community to mentor people and also pull resources. So it's particularly for people who need those resources and who are excluded from the mainstream, that is the way to survive and thrive.
So on the one hand, there is that shared purpose. There has to be a collective purpose to thrive and survive. And what's interesting with this example is that communities that have a sense of belonging because of a shared history, because of a shared language, a shared experience, those two coming together are the impetus for moving along that spectrum of outcomes towards more shared prosperity.
Right.
Might we consider that we can learn from those communities? You mentioned African American, you know, obviously in many pockets across America, particularly, I think because of the immigration coming in, because of the need to survive. Might we be looking for these communities which are on the margin, that are not in the mainstream VC, I'll use the term shareholder capitalist model, for inspiration for what Mariana Mazzucato refers to as an economics of hope?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that they've existed in we should look at our own history for
Mm,
one, because
mm,
most of the corporations originally were structured as co-ops. You
mm,
couldn't, in many states, there was a lot of suspicion of corporate power, particularly coming from um, England and sort of imperial power. So there was a lot of limitations, and people were only allowed to start joint stock companies to do something for themselves. They have to be benefiting from it themselves, like building a road. You know, the first corporation was actually Harvard University Education and other things.
mm.
So there was a lot of sort of different suspicious attitudes towards corporations, and co-ops were the main way to for many people to do business and to work. So it's one of the goals of this our equitable enterprise is also to elevate, to show that these things never quite disappeared. They're around us, but nobody teaches, well, very few people, I hardly anybody teaches. There are no case studies of co-ops that are taught at business schools. There's very little sort of emphasis on that. And one of the things that we want to do is elevate and amplify that this is not so alien. We want to normalize some of that, that this is all around us. It's existed in our history. It's around us today, and makes them seem less alien.
Mm. So it sounds like from the research you've done, and I encourage everyone to look at the original research report on equitable enterprises that was made publicly available, I believe, Maureen, at the end of last year. Is that? Yeah.
Yes.
That's on the Institute for the Future website. And then tomorrow, is it accurate to say you'll be sharing some of the latest research drawing on those qualitative interviews?
Yes, my colleague Rebecca Shamash was
wonderful. Yes, and we definitely need a big shout out to Rebecca. She was also instrumental in guiding us in writing this chapter. So as a wrap up, I've got the big question for you. It sounds like there is a clear shared purpose, whether it be to provide better health care in the face of interpandemics, whether it be to come together and be able to reduce our climate impacts, that third spectrum that we have in office shock. You've identified that there are a number of signals that give enough information for people who want to create an equitable enterprise to design one. And what I've learned in this conversation is the importance of a sense of belonging in a community that really pulls together that shared purpose in a way to then mobilize people for changing, an enterprise. So if all of those are in existence, and I love what you just shared, that actually it's in our history, it's all around us, we just haven't seen it, we haven't learned it. In your view, Marina, what is the number one or maybe top two stumbling blocks to be able to accelerate a transition to more equitable enterprises, however they may be defined or detailed?
Well, some of this that you mentioned don't exist yet, and they're big stumbling blocks. But, as we were talking to people and our advisors and experts and people running these enterprises, one theme that kept coming up, which is, you can do a lot of things in terms of regulation. You can do things in terms of taxation, transparency, and all of that is needed. And all of those are good things. And, you need to create capital sources for co-ops and community trusts and other kinds of things. Creation of public banks is one step in that direction. But the one theme underneath it all is that we need to change our register, back to that, which is we need to change our vocabulary, and we need to change the parameters of what we think is acceptable and desirable as a society. Like, at what point we say that the wage ratio or compensation ratio 1 to 300 between the average worker and the CEO is acceptable. In Mondragon, it's 1 to 6, right? And they were upset about it because it used to be 1 to 3. So to them, when they come to the US, we seem not normal. It seems alien, this idea that this is acceptable. To them, it's not acceptable. So changing the register means denormalizing certain things and normalizing other things. You know, it's interesting. I was talking to a friend in Switzerland where you are, and I was asking her about people who come to clean her house and how much she pays them. And she said, well, I pay them like $35 or something like that. And then I put into their social, I don't know what's called, social security account separately. And she said, I wouldn't think otherwise. That's just the norm. Those are kind of social and cultural norms that are deeply embedded. We don't have those norms. So it's ultimately, which is a harder thing, because once you change the register, once you change the vocabulary, once you move away from the idea that the whole purpose of the corporation is to return shareholder returns, then all other things become possible. Right. That's politicians start thinking in different terms. CEOs start thinking in different terms. Workers start thinking in different terms about what is acceptable and what is not. So to me, of all of those things, there's thousands of things that we can do to make corporations more equitable, to enable creation of more equitable enterprises. But underneath it all is that register. We need to change the register.
And tomorrow we're going to hear more about how to change the register, right? Okay.
It's the beginning in 2.5 hours.
If it were only that easy. You mentioned politicians, and there was a question. What do you see as the role of government in changing the register, in being able to help accelerate or encourage the transition to more equitable enterprises?
I think that a lot of things there, as I said, there's lots of things in terms of taxation and what we tax and how we tax. There's regulation around platforms and all kinds of things that can be done. But a lot of things can be done at the local level and at the regional level. That's what we're talking about a lot, because just like Silicon Valley has this unique ecosystem that's ideally suited for startups and technology, right? We have venture capitalists who give money and advice. We have accountants, we have lawyers who know how to do IPOs. We have accountants, all kinds of services. So we created this kind of a cluster, economists call it, regional economists call this cluster, that's kind of conducive to a particular model of innovation, a particular model of enterprise creation. Right. And a lot of things can be done at the local level to create similarly this kind of ecosystem for more equitable enterprises, for cooperatives. And there are places where it's happening. Obviously, Italy is one of those places. Spain is one. There's a number of co-ops in Oakland. And once first of all, they become visible because you meet somebody, they're your neighbor, they share knowledge, they share information, they cooperate in many ways. So at the regional and local level, there's a lot of things that governments can do to promote creation of more equitable local economies.
It's nice that you are identifying the regional, local. That also ties back to our part 3 of the book, choices for policymakers, for organizations, and then individuals. And that might be my last question, Marina. Any recommendations? What can individuals do to be able to either contribute to that kind of an ecosystem or to help cultivate an ecosystem that is going to be more fertile for more equitable enterprises?
Well, one thing is to just familiarize yourself with what's happening and read a lot of books. We can recommend, if you go to our website, read some of our advisors, read Jessica's Collective Courage book. There's lots of things that can be, that have been written about it. And the other thing is, if you look deeply around, you find those places and, talk to people who are running some, they're all around us. We just don't talk to them, we don't notice them. So, look for signals of this happening already.
Wonderful, wonderful. Marina, thank you so much. It was a wonderful opportunity to talk about such an important topic, which frankly, in a lot of the conversations that we're having with corporates, they're afraid to go there. And I really appreciate the work that you've been leading and the writing of Rebecca and the rest of the team, because it puts it into a way that I think invites that conversation. And so I think it's very, very valuable to be able to do that. So I want to thank you so much for.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
I'm looking forward to hearing more details tomorrow at TYF. I'd like to just remind everyone that next week we've got 2 talks. On Monday, we are going to have our first Office Shock talk with Office Shock, the book. Okay, so I'll repeat that. On Monday, we've got a special Office Shock talk with the book. Our colleague from the Institute for the Future, Jeremy Kirschbaum, has actually built a chatbot. And so Bob Johansen and I are going to be having an interactive conversation with the book. Then on Tuesday, same time as today's conversation, Bob and I will be speaking with Chuck Allen, a professor, on the topic of agility. And that is focused on our last spectrum. So we'll get those 2 spectrums next week, augmentation and agility. So I'm looking forward to continuing our Office Shock talks, continuing the conversations, exploring together how Office Shock can be turned into a great opportunity for creating better futures for working and living. Until next week, Marina, I want to thank you again and look forward to seeing everyone again next Monday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.